Welcome back to Make It Make Sense with Tomee Campbell. In this episode, we're going to be talking about advocating for women's sports from the Professional Women's Hockey League to the WNBA and beyond. So I'm very excited about the news that Toronto is getting a professional women's basketball team. I say this because I'm a fan, but I'm also excited because as a former athlete, I've had the pleasure of playing in semi-professional sports. Uh, Specifically, I was a football player for the Montreal Blitz, and which was a semi-professional women's football, full contact football team. I had always wanted to be a football player since I was a child. And when I was in high school, I didn't have that opportunity. I had the opportunity to play flag football and soccer, but it wasn't the same. And so I had an opportunity when I moved to Montreal in the mid 2000s to live out my dream. Actually, what I'm talking about, it's not mid 2000s. It was 2011. And I was able to uh, finally get on the field. I remember going and buying my helmet, and I have a very robust head. So I think my helmet size, it's all my helmet from when I was playing is like an extra large. And so I had to go around to many places and find my helmet, find my padding, and it was extraordinary. And I remember um, creating a video in which I was calling into the space, wanting to be a football player because I had to try out. You didn't just show up and the team didn't just accept you. You had to go, and I ended up for 2 seasons playing on the offensive line for the Montreal Blitz. Most at the time, we were the only Canadian team that was part of the International Women's Football League, and we played against American teams. And I also had the pleasure of going, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to try out, but representing Quebec, and the Quebec was getting together with other teams across full contact football teams across the country to get ready for to form the Canadian women's football team that would then play against full contact football teams across the world. Every 4 years, I believe they have a women's full contact football tournament. And I was injured, so I wasn't able to participate as a team player on the field, but I was able to get a uniform on, and I have some beautiful pictures and memories from that time. And being on the offensive line was a dream come true. I say this all as a setup for my excitement because I have always played sports at different levels of my journey. Then I was a powerlifter, and for a moment in time, I was a registered boxer at an amateur level. Yes, the kind of boxing that you see on television with the helmets and when you're amateur, you get you have to wear a helmet and gloves. And I boxed through Toronto Newsgirls Club, and that was transformative. So I have loved sports for all of my life. And so with that thrill of seeing and being an athlete, being a supporter of athletics for women, for gender non-binary folks, for men, and for folks who want to be a part of that sport in those sports and in those spaces. I think it's such a crucial time. We're at a pivotal moment in history, and history, their story of creating these more prominence within the sporting industry, if you will, of women's sports. In particular, as I mentioned at the outset of this episode, that Toronto is going to get its first WNBA team. That is, I'm so happy about that. And not only are we going to get the team, we're also, hopefully we'll see the team by 2026. And I believe that's when they're going to launch. I hope they will have more exhibition games of players who want to be on Toronto's team, as well as the WNBA coming here. But I think for me, the key things and why I wanted to share this episode and talk about this particular issue around advocacy and women's sports is that we are long past the time where we need to be thinking about and talking about women's sports and fairness of pay, looking at issues of systemic discrimination and barriers that exist. And I do know that across the sporting world, there are discussions that are happening around how do we make this sports, whether it's athletes on the field, employees behind the scenes, team ownership, uh, more open and creating a sense of belonging, addressing systemic discrimination, addressing anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, the other forms of intersectional forms of racism that exist within the sporting world, within our society in general. And how do we do that? So I wanted to talk about 4 points, and I would love to hear your feedback as you send me in ideas, storyline ideas for the podcast. And one of the ones that I really will want to do a series on is sort of the sporting world and athleticism, and how we can create more dynamic spaces around inclusion and belonging and integrating different perspectives and approaches to ensure that. First of all, that as advocates for women's sports and gender non-binary athletes and sports, is to think about the key things or foundational things that the leaders, the team players, the athletes on the side, all of the professionals and healthcare professionals that work with athletes, the team owners, the fans, and the community members in which these sports are played, is to either start or begin or continue to develop an understanding around what are the systemic barriers and issues that are happening on a regular basis to exclude people and from different sporting arenas, whether it's costs, whether it's discriminatory practices, whether it's biases. It's not a nice thing to talk about, but it's an essential thing, because at the end of the day, it's about creating spaces of wellness where the athlete, the team member, the community member, the fan, the employee can go in and thrive and sort of bring their best self forward. The other thing that I wanted to touch on was looking at integrating different types of practices. Now, for some of you listening to this podcast, you're thinking about, trauma-informed. You might use a trauma-informed approach. You may be using an anti-racism, anti-oppression approach. I think a number of approaches can be combined to really look at integrating a trauma-informed sort of a gender-based approach, anti-racism, anti-oppression approach, looking at the impact of sort of the positive, empowering side of sports, and removing the barriers and addressing some of the discriminatory or all of the discriminatory practices that prevent athletes and folks involved in the sports sector from really thriving. Looking at how to address and hopefully proactively any concerns that might come up as leaders and people investing money. Some of the athletes are investing in their sports equipment. They don't have sponsors, especially at the amateur and at the professional level, depending on what sport it is. And thinking about the people who are buying the teams, putting their resources into developing the teams, hiring the coaches, whether it's voluntary or they're getting paid. We have all different levels of responsibility and accountability to each other as a community. And how do we collectively say, okay, we're going to put some foundational practices in place. We're going to look at how power, privilege, marginalization, systemic biases, individual interpersonal relationships, and the biases that might exist in those spaces. And we're going to address them directly. And how will that, from a transformational perspective, how does that positively impact athletes? How will that make those transitions so that you see when an athlete is going on the field, they're able to just focus on the job at hand? Sadly, there's been examples across the sporting world, certainly what I've seen in Europe, and in other sporting arenas with men's soccer, what's happening on a professional level, where you have sports fans that are bringing in sort of anti-Black racism, whether it's discrimination and problems that are happening between team members. We know that these things exist. So what are we doing to more intentionally address them and bring it to the public's attention and awareness, and then embedding it in policies, practices, procedures, and protocols? The other thing that I think is important is to consider for those team members and those teams that are considering, again, widening out their pool, making sure that players from underrepresented communities are welcomed in, but beyond just sort of the the surface welcome in, they're doing, they're not doing it as a performative element of their leadership, but they're doing it with a sense of integrity and saying we want to make these changes. We recognize that racism and anti-Black racism and other forms of discrimination are in fact spaces that require us to be mindful, because racism is a health and safety issue. It is Toronto, for example, in Toronto Public Health declared anti-Black racism as a public health crisis in 2020. That hasn't gone away. So I think it's us being more mindful of how do we engage in change making, move where people are at, but also hold each other accountable and responsible, so we can make those changes. And I think having a code of conduct for fans is a great way. And I know there's organizations that are doing that, sporting organizations. And then once we have the code of conduct, how do we enforce it? Right. And how do we then encourage fans to be a part of the change making, so that their voices are heard, but the shifts that are happening mean something, because the fans also make up the athletes. They support the athletes. They are athletes in many cases, or former athletes, and so we can do a lot of work together and collectively. And I'd say that another piece of this is also looking at the empowerment and increasing the role of Indigenous, Black, racialized, historically marginalized players, from the team ownership to the athletes themselves, employees, healthcare professionals, and the community as a whole, where these professional or amateur and semi-professional sports are being played. We all have a role to play in making significant transformative changes so that we can see our teams and thrive in different ways. So I will end by saying that I've had an exciting time working with athletes, professional athletes, particularly male professional athletes at the Canadian Football League, CFL's Montreal Alouettes. Uh, Several decades ago, not several decades ago, it was about 10 years ago, I was able to meet with a group of athletes. They were going into community, doing community development work, because a lot of these professional teams, as a part of their development of their team leaders, is to reach out and give back to community. And so I even have some photographs of this time that collected the memories. I did a training for a group of the Montreal Alouettes. We were in their training, they're in their locker space. I went in and I sat with the athletes, and we talked about leadership with integrity. We talked about diversity, inclusion, and equity practices. And I asked them and encouraged them and shared some resources and tools about them thinking about power, privilege, marginality, where they come from, when they go into communities, who are they accountable to? How are they responsible to the young athletes and the youth that are there, that are sort of watching them as leaders and as influencers, and taking away some knowledge? Because oftentimes with this particular program, they were going into communities where it was very culturally diverse, ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse. And so the athletes came from all different backgrounds as well. And so we were talking about how do you communicate across social identities, and really make a lasting change with knowledge sharing, and not just sort of going in and imparting knowledge and expertise, but that sharing and that the collective community building. And so, through that excitement of working with these athletes and seeing and taking away lessons from working with professional athletes who are being paid, a sizable amount of money to do their work. They are working athletes. And so what do we need to be more mindful of, and what do they need to be more mindful of? I was able to sort of fast forward that into the work that I do now, and having conversations with community-based organizations, sporting organizations, and thinking about the next steps. And as from a philanthropic perspective, also thinking about where to invest time and resources in supporting athletes. I will say I'm excited that I'll be able to consider that because I know that I want to invest in uh, whether it's the professional women's basketball, amateur levels of different sports, because depending on your abilities and where you're at in your journey, I think that for me, I learned through my athletic endeavors to really connect with people and to be able to learn about how my body works, my mind works, how things connect, looking at strategically team building, connections with your teammates on and off the field. How do you protect and take care of each other? And then how do you move through conflicts? And so I integrate all of that knowledge into the work that I do on a day-to-day basis as a consultant, as an advisor, and as a professional development educator. And I would say that, you know, as we continue to consider advocacy in the sporting world is so important, that you think of your spheres of influence. If you're an athlete listening to this, how can you start these conversations or continue them? What do you think is important for people that just in general listening to this episode? I really want to hear your feedback and your thoughts. I do have a privilege of having great connections within the communities that I'm a part of and external to, where I might be asked to have a conversation with different athletes and different sporting venues, is to look at how do we take things to the next level? How do we operationalize the sense of belonging so that we are ensuring as the next generations of athletes move on into their respective areas or fields of practice, whether it's on a professional level or amateur or semi-professional, that we have ways and tools to proactively address systemic discrimination, removing the barriers, holding folks accountable, and finding ways to really thrive together as community members. So I would like to say thank you for listening to this episode of Make It Make Sense with Tomee Sojourner Campbell. And until next time, I hope to hear from you. I'm always looking for guests to come on and share their thoughts. And, you know, my hope is that we'll have some professional athletes that will be able to come on and speak to their experience, but also team owners as time moves on. So stay tuned and thank you. I like to move it, move it.